Welcome to the digital lecture series of FU West, the European Studies program of Freie Universität Berlin. In 15 sessions, we will offer you a broad overview of FU West's academic course offerings. You can choose from 12 subject course lectures representing a wide range of disciplines and 3 live sessions on German language and culture. Our series is divided into 4 themes relevant to European studies in Berlin and Germany today. Each will be dealt with by a group of FU West instructors from the perspectives of their particular disciplines or German language levels. Part 3 tackles pressing questions of the future and analyzes concepts and answers provided by European and German political actors, entrepreneurs, media experts, and philosophers. Join our instructors in their exploration of plans and challenges for a better tomorrow. All sessions will offer you insights into our instructors' semester-long regular courses within the FUBEST program and the way in which they integrate Berlin as a cultural and historical location. We hope you enjoy the online program we have assembled for you. For more details about the lecture series and the regular on-site FUBEST program, visit our website later. You will also find additional information at the end of today's lecture. With that, enjoy the following session and see you soon in Berlin.
Hello and welcome to the next FU Best Digital Lecture. My name is Detlef von Daniels. I teach 2 classes. In fall, the promise of German philosophy from Kant to Hegel, and in spring, tragedy and new beginnings in German philosophy, from Marx and Nietzsche to Habermas and Ratzinger. As the title suggests, these are survey courses. Nevertheless, they do not just present bits and pieces from everything, but follow a specific line of thought. In the 2 courses, we talk about the formation of a specific strand of the European discussion on enlightenment and its later ramifications. We start the first course with Immanuel Kant, who was a key figure in establishing a new kind of philosophy. We will later hear more about him. But we will also discuss the reaction to his thinking, most prominently by Hegel, who forged a new, though fragile, synthesis of the various aspects of Kant's philosophy. The class ends with 2 radical philosophical thinkers, Ludwig Feuerbach and Max Stirner, one leaning to the radical left, the other to the radical right. These are already many names. In the course we read even more. Here you see some of them. By the way, apart from their philosophical disagreement, German idealists and German materialists can also easily be distinguished by their opposing stances on facial hair. So the materialists are the hipsters. However, maybe you've recognized also something different. When reading the syllabus, you will notice that all philosophers on the syllabus are white European men. They are, moreover, and more significant, all Protestants. So let me add something which is not on the syllabus. In the course I explain how feminist, post-colonial and African perspectives could be included as alternative approaches. I mention, for example, Anton Wilhelm Amo, who was an African-German philosopher originally from what is now Ghana. He received in 1734, a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Halle, by the way, roughly 170 years before the first African-American received a PhD in philosophy from an American university. The critical perspective, which is a side aspect of the first course, is the center of the second. We start with Karl Marx, who is one of the most influential German philosophers and still influences debates on the future of capitalism, inequality, and the meaning of work. The course continues with Nietzsche and Heidegger. So one might think it is a typical course on the so-called continental tradition in philosophy. However, the title of the course is Tragedy and New Beginnings, so there's more about it. As you see, I have organized the course into 3 strands of thinking to show that the conventional distinction between analytical and continental philosophy is not helpful, as the reflection on the sciences is also one of the new beginnings in German philosophy. The course has also the word tragedy in the title. To illustrate this aspect, let's take a stroll in the city park of Vienna in 1913, which is at the same time the implicit intellectual center of the course. Here we will meet, among others, Sigmund Freud, the composer Arnold Schönberg, the painter Oskar Kokoschka, the legal theorist Hans Kelsen, the economist Ludwig von Mises, but also philosophers, most notably Ludwig Wittgenstein, probably in discussion with his fellow philosopher Moritz Schlick. The reason I mention this illustrious group of people in the park is that there are also three rather shabbily dressed men who lived at the same time in Vienna: Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Leon Trotsky. Thus, German philosophy is more than just an existentialist or intellectual discourse as in Nietzsche or Heidegger, but has an impact on the political world and in some distorted way also contributed in some ways to the catastrophe of the 20th century, the Holocaust. The dark twist at the end also taints the entire tradition of German philosophy. So, how can we get out of this? There's not the one solution. This enigma needs to be reflected in various forms and languages. Let me just name two possible answers, which at the same time frame the course. We will start the first course indeed not with Kant, but with Martin Luther, as he shaped through his translation of the Bible, his way of thinking and his music, the entire German philosophical tradition. At the same time, one has to say that Luther was a severe anti-Semite, so the seeds of the catastrophe seem to be sown right in the beginning. We will end the course with a discussion between Jürgen Habermas and Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI. Both experienced in their youth the totalitarian ideology of the Nazis and tried, through philosophy, theology, and building bridges to other traditions and ways of thinking, to overcome the cause of the rupture of civilization. At this point, I would like to change the register of your attention for a moment, as I usually do in each class, and play a short piece of music. Of course, not just any music, but one that reflects this 500-year discourse that commenced with Luther. There are two music courses offered at FU Best, where you will get an overview of German music, starting with Johann Sebastian Bach, the Viennese school of classical music, up to opera and contemporary pop music. Here, I will give you just a 3-minute piece of music, though you will hear reminiscences to all of this. The piece is part of a chamber opera called The Emperor of Atlantis by Viktor Ullmann, a pupil of Arnold Schönberg, whom we have met earlier in the park. He wrote the piece while he was in the concentration camp Theresienstadt, and he was shortly afterwards murdered in Auschwitz. The music reflects both German history and the history of music. What you will hear is a short section that echoes the German national anthem. The anthem has a multifaceted history as well. It was originally composed by Joseph Haydn for the birthday of Emperor Joseph II in 1796, became in the 19th century a symbol for German unification, and in 1948 the national anthem of the Federal Republic of Germany. In Ullmann's adaptation, you will hear the music in a distorted way, like the surreal reign of the Emperor of Atlantis, who is called the Emperor over all. Here are first a few bars from the national anthem, and then afterwards you will hear the adaptation by Ullmann. The overview of the two courses has already prepared the topic of my talk: How can we live together? German philosophy's answers since Kant. After hearing the entire bandwidth of what German philosophy includes, you might ask yourself why. Why on earth should we be interested to hear what philosophers have to say about the question how we should live together, given that they are part of a questionable tradition? Isn't it preposterous in the first place to assume that some people, philosophers, have the authority to say how we should live together? Or only give me an advice how I should live my life? And since we are not living back in the 18th or 19th century, but in the 21st century, should we turn to scientists in the first place? Here's what one scientist has to say about one particular idea of living together, the Black Lives Matter movement. Say it with me: no lives matter, since we are just random accidents of evolution and our so-called moral truths are just biochemical reactions in our brain. No human lives or any lives at all actually matters. This is what one prominent atheist says, Richard Dawkins. We are just trying to be logically consistent, he added. Though the movement quickly fell apart, though, when leaders had trouble convincing followers that the No Lives Matters movement actually mattered. Obviously, this slide is a joke. Richard Dawkins is a respected evolutionary biologist and never said this. However, it is a good joke as it reveals something about us. First of all, there is indeed a difference between what scientists can find out about how human beings lived together in prehistorical times and how we nowadays should live together. This is not to say that these sciences, or evolutionary biology in particular, have nothing to say about the question, or that these sciences are completely value-free. They do have values, though they presuppose in particular certain values. The idea that what is true should not be dogmatically believed, but can only be determined through scientific inquiries. Moreover, the sciences presuppose a certain a we of people who are enlightened and follow a certain method of inquiry. At this point, I would like to take recourse to a semantic trick, only to resolve the trick later on. The trick is to say that this presupposition is a legacy of the area of enlightenment, in which the German discussion played a special role, as the German term for sciences, the Wissenschaften, does not only denote the natural sciences, but is a generic term that includes all sciences, the natural sciences, the social sciences, but also the human sciences, in English humanities, in German Geisteswissenschaften. Thus, the German language suggests to put everything under scrutiny. Someone who thinks along these lines is the evolutionary psychologist Steven Pinker. In his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Decline of Violence in History and Its Causes, he argues that the decline of violence within societies and between states is a legacy of the area of enlightenment. He argues that once science is accepted as paradigm how to gain knowledge, reason naturally stretches across the globe as reason is universal. Morality is then, according to Pinker, a consequence of the interchangeability of perspectives and the opportunity the world provides for positive-sum gains. He credits Kant in particular for having discovered the social scientific law that democratic government, free trade and international organizations together lead in form of a moral learning process to the decline of violence within states and peaceful relations amongst nations. Now, this might already sound like the answer to the question, how should we live together? Namely, by relying on the sciences, or to be more precise, the method of rational discourse, which ultimately lead to more discoveries and path the way to live in freedom and peace together. Moreover, the answer is given by a respected scientist, with philosophy serving, so to say, as a subordinated assistance. Why can't we stop at this point? You might presume, because my time isn't up, I still have 30 minutes to go. So there must be something wrong or missing in the account, and the clue for this must be hidden somewhere in the lecture so far. First of all, we have already heard in the overview of the course that Kant is not an isolated figure, but belongs to a tradition of German thought that includes some questionable figures such as Nietzsche, and even an outspoken Nazi such as Heidegger. However, with regard to this apparently mere historical observation, Steven Pinker seems to have the appropriate answer. He argues that one also has to take into account the counter-movement of Counter-Enlightenment or Romanticism. He singles out a number of German idealists, in particular Johann Georg Hamann, Friedrich Jacobi, Johann Gottfried Herder and Friedrich Schelling, and faults them for having attacked the foundations of reason itself. They criticized first the idea of the disembodied individual reasoner ripped from his culture and its history. Second, those people questioned the existence of a universal human nature and a universally valid system of reasoning. Instead, they claimed that people are embedded in a culture, including their myths, symbols, and epics. For truly understanding ancient or foreign cultures, it is necessary to reproduce the experiences through empathy. To put it in a nutshell, for the Counter-Enlightenment philosophers, universality, objectivity, and rationality were out. Romanticism, vitalism, intuitionism, and irrationalism were in. The consequence of this way of thinking are, according to Pinker, the emergence of aggressive nationalism, romantic militarism, and Marxist socialism. Pinker's solution is to pick out only the good tradition and disregard the rest. And indeed, who in his right mind would want to defend irrationalism or immoralism? However, there are some problems connected with this solution. Many of the philosophers Pinker's names were either students of Kant or people who have studied his work closely. So it suggests itself asking what exactly went wrong in the reception of Kant. Simply accusing one half of the philosophical tradition of irrationalism or immoralism doesn't help, as it presumes a standard of morality and objectivity which is in question. In order to wade in on the discussion between Enlightenment and Counter-Enlightenment, many people nowadays pick a certain Enlightenment philosopher and denounce him, it will always be a male philosopher, as racist, sexist, or imperialist, to show that the Enlightenment tradition is one-sided as well. However, I would like to pursue a different line of argument and focus on the logic of Pinker's argument. He depicts an us against them. Thus, we are the rational, enlightened ones, and those are the irrational or immoral ones. However, if this were the case, there is no real point in talking anymore, as it seems to be impossible to reason with someone who is unreasonable. Pinker's argument is a case of the familiar move in unfruitful discussions characteristic of the culture wars. Whoever is criticizing my position must fall under my theory. Thus, whoever is criticizing a specific aspect of feminism must be a chauvinist. Whoever is criticizing a specific aspect of psychoanalysis must have a suppressed conflict, and whoever is criticizing a specific aspect of enlightenment must be irrational. How did we get into this mess? We have started by investigating some presuppositions of the sciences. All we wanted was finding a path for a peaceful way of living together, and now we are in the midst of a war. More important, how do we get out of this? Obviously, it would not help to pick out one of the sides and dig in one's heel, as it would yield the question on which ground or criteria this choice has been made in the first place. There seems to be no higher, so to say, no neutral ground to appeal to. So my suggestion is going back to the origin of the diversion of the two traditions. As it happens, Kant is invoked by both traditions. So let's see whether we can find in Kant some resources to enlighten our current self-understanding. The reason we now turn to Kant is not because he is an important or famous figure, but because he's at the origin of the problem we face today. The way we have developed the problem already suggests some caution not to monopolize Kant prematurely for one side or the other. So it would not help to pick on Kant to smash one side or the other. And the best way of heeding this advice is to gain, in the first step, some historical distance and read Kant as someone who was answering to problems out of the context of his time. Thus, we do not take the historical approach because history is in any way important in itself, but to be attentive for the many possible trajectories of human life and thinking has at any point of history. A few observations regarding the life and circumstances of Kant might illustrate this point. Kant was born in 1724 in Königsberg, a city in the far east of Prussia. He died in 1804 in Königsberg without having ever traveled to any other place. Königsberg was a special place in Prussia and Germany. During Kant's lifetime, Germany was not a unified nation-state, but consisted of hundreds of subunits, kingdoms, principalities, duchies, counties, prince-bishoprics, free cities, and all kinds of other domains, all loosely united under an emperor who had indeed very little power. Prussia was one of the states that gained throughout the 18th century through aggressive wars against the emperor, so to say as a rebellious state, a dominant position within this loose federation. Königsberg was at this time an important trading port where different ethnic groups met. Poles, Russians, people from other countries around the Baltic Sea, and there was also a significant Jewish community. Königsberg also had strong civic institutions. One of the mayors of Königsberg was, for instance, a long-time friend of Kant. One episode might illustrate this special arrangement. During the 7th Years' War, Königsberg was for 3 years occupied by Russian troops. The occupation did not involve any fighting. The city was simply handed over to the new powers. Officials swore allegiance to the Russian emperor, and life continued as before. Thus, even though people in Königsberg witnessed and experienced the shifting political circumstances, the city was never a site of political struggle, but rather the site of observers of politics, so to say a cosmopolitan city in thought only. We will see that this special position is also reflected in Kant's thinking. Now, how can Kant help us? The question we are pursuing is, how can we live together? One possible answer is through enlightenment, but we are lost when it comes to answering the question, what is enlightenment? Incidentally, many people at Kant's time presumed to promote enlightened causes as well, and yet a prominent pastor and publicist, Friedrich Zöllner, complained in a popular literary journal, the Berlinische Monatsschrift, that he found nowhere a concise answer to the question, what is enlightenment? In the next issue of the journal, Kant gave an answer in his famous essay from 1784 with the title, An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? The first sentence of this essay reads, Enlightenment is human beings' emergence from his self-incurred minority. Thus, Kant claims that we are like minors who cannot take fully responsibility for their lives. But this state of minority we are in is not the fault of others, so to say, of the society or the system. It is our fault. How can this be? Kant explains that, I quote again, minority is the inability to make use of one's own understanding without direction from another. This is indeed how children behave who follow, let's say not always, but often, the advice of their parents and teachers, as they know best what is good for them. Kant continues to argue that minority is self-incurred, as its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in lack of resolution and courage to use reason without direction from another. Thus, according to Kant, we have already everything we need to become enlightened or to emerge out of our self-incurred minority. We do not need any additional training or institutional prerequisites. All we need is courage to make use of our own understanding. This might sound like good news for everyone who dislikes schools, education, or institutions in general. Apparently, we don't need them and can just go on and follow our own understanding. So, is enlightenment about doing as one pleases? This was indeed a common criticism of enlightenment at the time. It is best expressed by a moral tale by Friedrich Zöllner, which is printed in the same edition as Kant's essay. In German, the poem rhymes. I've got only a rough English translation. A monkey once pokes a grove of cedars on fire at night, and then he was so happy when he found this so bright. Come on, brother, see what I can do. I turn night into day. The brothers came, great and small, admire the shine, and everyone started yelling, "Long live Brother Hans! Monkey Hans is worthy of lasting fame. He has enlightened the realm." In this poem, enlightenment is criticized for destroying everything that has been naturally grown without producing any substantial values apart from an ephemeral glimmer. Enlightenment, far from being the highway to the solution of our problems, seems to be the danger for human beings living together. Kant couldn't have read the tale before he wrote the essay. Nevertheless, we find an answer to it in the essay as well. Kant starts his argument by explaining why so many people remain in a state of minority out of laziness and cowardice. This state of affairs is, of course, also very comfortable for the guardians, for the established power relations. Therefore, they warn of the dangers when leaving the predetermined rules of education, of moral teaching, of what the job market requires, and so on. This is a short psychological characteristic of the predicament we find ourselves in. We are not just committed to reason, science, and critical reasoning. We are also lazy and coward and are constantly told what is in our best interest. We know all this. Do this, do that, otherwise you won't get a job or you won't find a partner, and we have to follow this policies, other the other economy is going down, and we cannot appear weak in the eyes of other nations, and so on and so forth. These are just a few of the many must and don'ts that are uttered by the well-meaning guardians and authorities. Now, how do we get out of this? In principle, Kant holds, it is possible for each individual to work herself out of it, though it is, of course, very difficult to stand alone against the current. Therefore, Kant introduces one key notion, the public. So I quote, "But that a public should enlighten itself is more possible. Indeed, this is almost inevitable if only it is left its freedom. For there will always be a few independent thinkers, even among the established guardians of the great masses, who, after having themselves cast off the yoke of minority, will disseminate the spirit of a rational valuing of one's own worth and of the calling of each individual to think for himself. Thus, all we need are some independent thinkers and a free public sphere. Once they can freely converse in the public, they are like leaven, and the public will enlighten itself. However, one might replay that by broadening the perspective and bringing in the public, Kant has not really solved the problem posed by the monkey tail. It could still be that the few independent thinkers are indeed demagogues who rush the public into the ruins. Therefore, Kant introduces two caveats, which give his account its specific flavor. First, he distinguishes between private and public use of reason, while using the terms private and public in a specific way. Whenever we are in an official position, such as a tax official or a teacher at a university, we make, according to Kant, private use of reason, as we have to comply to the standards of our profession. Only as scholars, when we address the entire public of the, what Kant says, the world of readers, we make public use of reason. The important point is that private use of reason can be restricted. Thus, tax officials cannot simply disregard certain tax laws or invent a new tax law, even if they have good reasons to do so. Likewise, appointed preachers at a church cannot simply invent their own cult, and even university professors are bound to teach what they are assigned. So, where do we find public use of reason? Whenever someone steps out of his or her role and discusses a topic, be it the best tax regime, the persuasiveness of religious beliefs, or a certain philosophical tradition, in a public forum, he is then, as Kant writes, no longer part of the machine, but regards himself or herself as member of a cosmopolitan community. The second caveat has to do with the aim of Enlightenment reasoning. One might think that the first or ultimate aim are political reforms. Here, Kant is more restrained. He argues, and here I quote again, "A public can achieve enlightenment only slowly. A revolution may well bring about a falling of personal despotism and of voracious or tyrannical oppression, but never a true reform in one's way of thinking. Instead, new prejudices will serve just as well as all old ones to harness the great unthinking masses." Thus, political reforms are not at the focus of Kant's attention, as he aims at a more thorough reform of our way of thinking, and knows that prejudices are found in any established thought system. It is again a psychological observation, though this time one that applies self-critical to the discourse of enlightenment itself. Even a reform or revolution that started with the enlightened causes can turn into a new dogmatic belief system that is secured by the new guardians who behave exactly as the old ones by invoking fear in anyone who tries to think for him or herself. Let's take a moment to look back and see how far Kant's account brings us. Our question is, how can we live together? We were initially doubtful whether philosophy has any authority to answer this question. Instead, we turned to the sciences only to get tangled up in a discussion about the legacy of enlightenment. Kant's answer that enlightenment is emergent from self-incurred minority is then significant for two reasons. First, it does not take part in a culture war between us and them, but foremost turns the direction to ourselves. Minority is self-incurred out of laziness and cowardice. Second, Kant promotes neither an anything-go license or a strict discipline, but shows that both have a certain role to play, and there's a constant back and forth between structure and questioning the structure. To use a philosophical expression, a dialectic between private and public use of reason. Today's revolutionary critical perspective on a topic can be tomorrow's dogmatism. Last but not least, even though the overall aim of Enlightenment discourse is practical, that is aiming at changing the world we live in, it should, according to Kant, not focus exclusively on political affairs, but take into account the entire breadth of human experience. Now, we might reply that this all sounds a bit abstractly and still doesn't solve the clash between a pro-enlightenment and a counter-enlightenment or romantic attitude. Wouldn't Kant dismiss irrationality and immoralism as well? Again, Kant's answer would commence at a different point, the inner attitude. We have heard that what is required to emerge from the self-incurred minority is courage. Courage is, like laziness and cowardice, a feeling, but a feeling of a specific kind. As a feeling, it belongs not to our rational, but to our sensual nature, and is therefore ultimately irrational. Anyone who claims being able to give a complete rational explanation of a feeling, as for instance the feeling of love, to a person, doesn't really understand the idea of a feeling. Or maybe he or she has never loved anyone and therefore doesn't know that love is not like liking ice cream. Thus, as we count on courage, we cannot exclude irrationality from philosophy, but have to find ways to deal with it, better to cultivate it. Courage is, according to Kant, a specific feeling. On the one hand, it is an affect somewhere between impudence and indulgence, thus, like all affects, is part of a web of related feelings, a gray area that cannot be clearly classified. On the other hand, courage is not like pain, a mere feeling, but can also be aroused by reason. It is then genuine bravery or strength of virtue. The courage to use one's own reason Kant speaks of is a form of irrationality that fosters enlightenment. One might reply that promoting this kind of irrationality is like promoting things like courage to study very hard or praising the love of a beautiful and virtuous woman. However, there's also a second aspect connected to courage that brings us closer to the aspect of immorality. Courage does not just mean to question authority in a duly and respectful way, but includes a certain boldness of expression and a deviation of a common rule. Thus, courage appears as a blemish, and authorities feel morally justified to rebuke it. Therefore, courage is often found in revolutionary zealots who are steadfast in their beliefs and show a certain purity of mind, but pursue, in retrospect, not always truly worthy causes. Here we see that the two aspects Steven Pinker wanted to exclude from the legacy of enlightenment, irrationality and immorality, are included in Kant's accounts as moments to further its cause. Thus, by reading Kant, we have found a way to overcome the unfruitful culture war between us enlightened ones and those irrational and immoral ones. Moreover, we have gained a preliminary understanding why Kant could stand at the beginning of both traditions. However, one might ask that for getting a comprehensive understanding, we also need some examples. We need to know what this means in historical reality or for our lives today. I've explained that Kant lived his entire life in the city of Königsberg, where he witnessed the events of his time, such as the unfolding of the Enlightenment attitude, the 7th Year War, and the American and particularly the French Revolution, and of course its turbulent aftermath. However, he did not take an active political role. Thus, he did not call for a revolution in the city of Königsberg or in Prussia. For this reason, it is sometimes said that the revolution French and Americans enacted happened in Germany only in the mind. The entire tradition of German idealism appears to be a mind game. With regard to Hegel, people also use more hefty expressions. However, considering the circumstances of Kant's life more closely, this common conception turns out to be misleading. We have heard that Kant made a distinction between the private and the public use of reason. As a university professor, he duly taught the courses he was assigned to teach and never openly criticized the authorities. A possible historical explanation for this quietist attitude is that when living in a remote area such as Königsberg, under the shackles of a militarized state, in a multi-layered federal structure like the German Empire, then calling for a revolution wouldn't really have been a promising strategy. Thus, Germany was not like France, a unified nation state, where you just had to capture the capital and to seize the entire country. Instead, Germany consisted of literally hundreds of capitals of different sizes and kinds of governments, some good, some rather bad ones. There is, however, also a philosophical explanation. Kant mentions at the end of his essay on enlightenment Frederick the Great, and he praises him for guaranteeing public peace and freedom of speech in a way, and then he quote, a free state could not do. And Kant explains that here a paradoxical cause is revealed in human affairs. He writes, a greater degree of civil freedom seems advantageous to a people's freedom of spirit, and nevertheless puts up insurmountable barriers to it. A lesser degree of the former, on the other hand, provides a space for the latter to expand to its full capacity. When Kant refers to a free state, he must have the United States of America in mind, as this was at the time the essay was published the only state that was founded on the principles of enlightenment. The unexpected or paradoxical course of history he speaks of is that freedom of spirit, thus the most thorough philosophical examination of freedom in all areas of thinking, happened at this time not in Boston but in Königsberg. Still, one might hold this historical speculation also against Kant and see it as a rather lame excuse for his political inactivity. However, this would again miss a crucial aspect of Kant's life and thinking. He was not just a university professor, but had also daily conversations over lunch, where he met with public officials, with merchants, writers, and other academics. These table conversations are often seen as the germs of a genuine public sphere, a space between the official roles where ideas could flourish freely and where these ideas then had some long-term effects. Moreover, there was at least one instance when Kant did pick a fight with officials, namely by publishing a critical piece on religion. As religion was, through teaching in schools, in universities and churches, a very influential discourse everyone was acquainted with, Kant's intervention had a crucial impact on religious and on social affairs in Prussia. It would take at this point too long to explain the entire affair. The key point is to see that Kant set his hope not on the one-time political revolution, but on mankind's ability to work its way gradually out of barbarism of their own accord. Nevertheless, he did not shy away from using his intellectual skills in specific circumstances in form of very timely political interventions. The historical context that serves to explain how Kant's ideas about enlightenment can be put into practice. However, you might still ask what all this means for us today, for our lives. We cannot presume to live in intellectual glorious times. There is no time for long lunch conversations, and students are restricted in their choices by the demands of the job market and the straitjacket of their student loans. So let me conclude with a somewhat obvious recommendation for students. If you want to emancipate from other people's direction, the many well-meant advisors of the guardians, a semester abroad, for instance in Berlin, is a good start. The most important lesson will be to experience a different value system, different life world, and thus realize that things can also be changed at home, or maybe that things are at home in place for a certain reason. Berlin has, of course, no beaches, and the weather in winter is rather bleak. However, the dialectical flip side of this is that this way you are forced to turn your attention into your inner self. You will see the legacy of German idealism, but also of Marxism and the darkest hour of German history, National Socialism. Berlin is also an intellectual place where its history is taken up and reflected, and people try to overcome its failings. It is a place where it is possible to take part in public debates in different venues. Many of them are also in English. Thus, I would encourage you to step out of your familiar context, not just to enter in a study abroad program, so to say, enter the next system, but to become a citizen of the world. Incidentally, the answer to the initial question and the doubts we have voiced has been found. If you want to emerge from minority, you have to recognize it as a self-incurred minority, one that can be overcome not by appeal to any higher authority or scientific insight, but through historical investigation into the structure and events that constitute ourselves. If this were an address at an American university during normal times, I would end the talk by calling upon you to embrace your courage. However, as we are living in extraordinary corona times, and as I am speaking from a German university with German history of philosophy in mind, I have to end with a twist. A twist you will only understand when delving deeper into the history of existentialist philosophy. So, I would like to call upon you to embrace your courage and your angst. Thank you for your attention.
We hope you enjoyed this week's lecture. You can find the dates and descriptions for all sessions in our digital lecture series, as well as information about our instructors and their courses on our website. Also, connect with us on social media and attend one of our informational webinars. Thank you very much for watching, and we hope to see you again soon, online or on site in Berlin.